Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be talking about a theology of the fall in our continuing study of Old Testament theology. Last time we looked at in Genesis chapters 1, 2, but especially chapter 3. In chapters 1 and 2, there was the creation, life, and innocence, and the presence of God. And then we noticed in chapter 3 that there was the fall, death took place, sin came, and they were banished from God's presence. We're going to see those same three things, not necessarily in the same order, but they're going to happen again in chapter 4, where again there's going to be sin, again there's going to be death, and again there will be banishment from God's presence. In chapter 3, it started with Adam and Eve, and they were in the garden. Chapter 4 now begins with Adam and Eve giving birth to Cain and Abel. They're outside the garden, but perhaps still in the vicinity of that garden. In chapter 3, as the chapter opens, Adam and Eve are innocent. Now as it opens, it's Cain and Abel that we will see, and we will see evidence of sinfulness. Not that anything bad is mentioned about Abel, but they will both be bringing sacrifices to God. In chapter 3, the serpent comes, but I do think it's Satan there, who comes to the woman and speaks with her openly, that is through the serpent. You can't see Satan, he's behind the scenes. In chapter 4, Satan is still tempting Cain, but he's in the background where we don't even see a serpent, we don't see anyone. And yet there is an allusion to a presence that is there. In chapter 3, Adam and Eve's sin was in disobeying God by eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. In Genesis 4, Cain's sin is going to be threefold. He will offer an unacceptable sacrifice. Then we will see his anger and his jealousy. And finally, it will culminate as he murders his own brother. In chapter 3, God seeks out Adam and Eve and interrogates them until they admit their guilt. In chapter 4, God seeks out Cain and interrogates him, and he's going to refuse to acknowledge his guilt. He will be trying to justify himself. In chapter 3, the earth is cursed as a result of Adam's sin. In chapter 4, the earth will no longer yield its increase for Cain. In chapter 3, the chapter ends with Adam and Eve's expulsion from the garden. They're placed out of the garden. In chapter 4, the chapter ends when Cain is banished to the land of Nod, to the land of wandering. In his fictional book, East of Eden, John Steinbeck calls this chapter, Genesis chapter 4, the symbol story of the human soul. And even though I believe it took place literally and physically, it is also symbolic for us as we see the effects of the fall. So chapter 4, verse 1, now the man had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain, and she said, I have gained, that is, I have gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord. And so that word Cain, there's a play on words with that. Kana is he has gotten. There's a play on words where he's the getting one. He's the one who has gotten something, and he's the prized possession. When we look at Cain, we see an interesting contrast with Jesus. In Cain's case, he brings an unworthy sacrifice. When we get to Jesus, he is the worthy sacrifice. In Cain's case, he offered a sacrifice that did not involve the shedding of blood. Now, I'm not saying that that's what made it unworthy, although the symbolism is helpful for us because Jesus, he is the sacrifice who sheds his own blood. In Cain's case, he becomes angry and he becomes jealous. In Jesus' case, he prayed for the forgiveness of those who wronged him. He said, Father, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing. In Cain's case, he murdered his brother. In Jesus' case, he gave his life to make us his brothers. And so in verse 2, again she gave birth to his brother Abel. And Abel was a keeper of flocks, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. So they take different professions. There are not a lot of professions to be had back then, but they take the two available professions. And Abel, the word Abel, Habel means empty. In fact, that's the word. Remember in Ecclesiastes, throughout Ecclesiastes, you're going to see that phrase, vanity of vaniness, or emptiness of emptinesses. And that's going to be the same word, Abel, Abel, Habel. Why did they call their son empty? I'm not sure. Maybe it was the realization that there had been a fall. And as little Cain began to grow up, they began to realize, oh no, this is not going to end well. Verse 3, so it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering of the Lord of the fruit of the ground. Now, there's nothing wrong with bringing an offering of fruit from the ground. We're going to see some of the offerings. There will be offerings that involve death and a sacrifice, but there will be other offerings that involve fruit from the ground. And so we're not told that the reason for the problem was because it was fruit from the ground, but he brings an offering of fruit from the ground. Verses 4 and 5, Abel on his part also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. The issue here, the Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering, but for Cain and for his offering, he had no regard. We're not told why. I suspect it was something of the heart. I suspect there was an inner problem, but we're not told. Middle of verse 5, so Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell. Verse 6, then the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, here's the warning, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. Notice those words, desire and master. You see, those same words had been used back in chapter 3 and verse 16, where the woman had been told, yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will master you, or he will rule over you. Same Hebrew word there. And now there's a warning here that there's similarly something taking place. Something that is seeking to desire you the way a woman desires her man. And yet you must master it. You must do that which a man does over a woman. You must master that. And it's not talking about female things. It's talking about the sin that lies at the door. Verse 8, Cain told Abel his brother, and it came about when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. Now we see the murder that takes place. And so the story had started with Cain's, I'm going to take this as Cain's self-will, his attitude, that was behind the scenes, and he offers a sacrifice that is not acceptable. I don't know if it was because it was we're not told. Was it because it was a plant sacrifice instead of an animal sacrifice? Perhaps, but that's not specified in the passage. And so God rejects Cain's sacrifice for whatever reason, and then Cain becomes angry. So we begin with the attitude. I think there's an attitude of self-will there, and now an attitude of anger, and Cain's countenance falls. So notice in the green, that's his attitude. In the blue, that's the resulting action. In the red, here's what happens as a result. God warns Cain. This is God's action. And now we see the attitude, his anger returns to jealousy, and that jealousy now becomes murder, as Cain takes the action of murdering Abel. Verse 9, then the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? And he said, now he lies, notice. He doesn't confess. I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? He is seeking to divert suspicion. He's seeking to justify his actions while not admitting to his own actions. Verse 10, he said, that is, God said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Notice the presence of the blood. The blood, not from a sacrifice, but from a murder. and it speaks to the Lord. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 24 picks up this theme, where it speaks of Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood which speaks better than the blood of Abel. The blood of Abel was blood that ought not to have done, and yet it spoke. It spoke and it called for judgment. The blood of Jesus calls not for judgment, but it calls for forgiveness, because it was shed for us. Verse 11, God continues, "Now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you cultivate the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you, because it has been watered with blood that was unjustly shed. Now it will be in a state of antagonism against you, and you will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth." He is now driven out, not just from near the presence of God, but from his own people. He will be a wanderer. He will be, in the way you say that, he will be a nod. In fact, he's going to go to the land of wandering in a moment upon the earth. Verse 13, Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is too great to bear." Notice, even now, he's not concerned about the evil that he had done, but he's concerned about the punishment that is being meted out to him. And so he continues, verse 14, "Behold, you have driven me this day from the face of the ground, and from your face I will be hidden, and I will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. Woe be unto me." Now, there's not a lot of people out there to kill him, but he knows that eventually there will be more, and he can sort of see the population will eventually grow, and he's worried that someone might take vengeance upon him. Verse 15 says, "The Lord said to him, Therefore whoever kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord appointed a sign for Cain, so that no one finding him would slay him." We're not told what the sign is. I think we're not told what the sign is so that if somebody today perhaps had something similar that might have looked like that sign, there won't be a wrong stigma. But there's a sign placed upon Cain for his protection, because God says, look, I am going to oversee judgment. Now, in the future, we're going to see that changes. But for right now, God says, I will oversee judgment. And so I will protect Cain, even though he's guilty, even though he's deserving even of death. But that's not in the cards yet. That will be postponed. And so, verse 16, "And then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod." There's that word again, the land of wandering, east of Eden. So in chapter 3, we had the serpent coming and deceiving Eve. Now we have God warning Cain that sin is crouching at the door. In chapter 3, Adam and Eve they had eaten of the forbidden fruit. Now Cain had murdered his brother. In chapter 3, Adam and Eve had begun the cycle of sin. Here in chapter 4, that cycle continues in the persons of Cain. In chapter 3, God comes in the cool of the day to seek out and to question Adam and Eve. In chapter 4, God comes and seeks out and questions Cain about his brother. Chapter 3, Adam and Eve are banished from the garden. Here in chapter 4, Cain is banished to a land of wandering, to a foreign land. Verse 17, Cain had relations with his wife, and of course everybody wants to know where did he get his wife from, and I think the answer there is given in Genesis chapter 5, where Adam and Eve had many sons and daughters. This evidently was a family relation, I suppose, a sister. Later on that would be forbidden, but that had not yet been forbidden. So Cain had relations with his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. Not the same Enoch that walks with God. This is going to be another Enoch, and the names will be similar. And he built a city and called the name of the city Enoch, after the name of his son. Eventually there's going to be lots of offspring that come forth. Verse 19, Lamech, and we jump way down to Lamech. There's a number of descendants, but we come down to the seventh descendant, and that is Lamech. Lamech took to himself 2 wives. The name of one was Ada, and the name of the other Zillah. Now this is the first time that polygamy has been mentioned. So far it's been, we had Adam and Eve, and Cain took his wife, but now here's one that takes to himself two wives. He sort of breaks the mold. Verse 20, Ada gave birth to Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. And his brother's name was Jubal, and he was the father of all those who play the lyre and the pipe. And as for Zillah, she also gave birth to Tubal-Cain, the forger of all implements of bronze and iron. That's not to say that you had the Iron Age, but in other words, you began working with hard things like stone, and eventually copper and bronze, and down the road is going to be iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah, which just means beautiful. And so we have all the elements, all the beginning elements of what eventually would lead to a society. Whether it's the raising of livestock or musical instruments or the workings of different sort of tools in bronze and iron and beauty, and all of these are pictured in the origins here, in this origin story. And yet, like the origin story that we had with Cain and Abel, now there's also going to be a death that has taken place. Lamech said to his wives, and this is given in verse. The verse starts off, Ada and Zillah, listen to my voice. You wives of Lamech, give heed to my speech. And notice, you wives of Lamech are Ada and Zillah. Listen to my voice is the same thing as give heed to my speech. And now we get to the circumstances. For I have killed a man for wounding me, and a boy for striking me. Now, was this two different people? I don't think it is. I think it's poetry, and so the man is really the boy, and wounding me is the same as striking me. He's claiming, either justified or non-justified, is this a self-defense, or has he been insulted, and now he has taken it upon himself to murder someone? It's not entirely clear, so I want to be fair. But he goes on, verse 24, if Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. In other words, I have much more right, and maybe he's saying much more strength. In that, notice the pattern has escalated. The pattern has escalated, and that's the nature of sin. Sin grows. And the fall did not remain with Adam and Eve. It did not remain with Cain and Abel, but it has continued throughout all generations. Verse 25, Adam had relations with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son, named him Seth, for she said, God has appointed me, he has Seth me, another offspring in place of Abel. So the word Seth is the same idea, it's similar as Seth. He has appointed me another offspring in place of Abel, for Cain killed him. We come to verse 26. To Seth, to him also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. And then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. Next we have a genealogy in chapter 5, but then we get to chapter 6. There is a change. So in chapter 4, we have the descendants of Cain. There's a picture of those who are following in the way of Cain till we get to the end there. Then the scene has shifted back to Seth, which introduces chapter 5. Chapter 5 is the descendants of Seth, and it's a picture of those who were descended through him. And notice then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. So there's hope there. But finally, we come to chapter 6, and chapter 6 speaks of how there's an intermarriage between the sons of God and daughters of men. Given the context, that may well be picturing the descendants of Seth and the descendants of Cain. If not, and there's other theories out there as to who those sons of God and daughters of men could be. We'll look at that later. But in any case, it's a picture, chapter 6 is a picture of moral wickedness. That you have had a fall take place, and even though there was hope, and even though there were those who were calling upon the name of the Lord, notice when you have the intermingling pictured by marriage, just as you'd had the picture of Lamech, who had two wives, now I'm going to have intermarriage of wives and men and things like that. That becomes a picture of wickedness, which will result in the fall.